In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
I tell you what, I'm going to let you and Nick get acquainted. I'm going to dip out for a few and let this be the Nick and Rick show or the Rick and Nick show, and let you guys compare notes on the People's Party movement across North America. So I'll be back
Sure.
in a few.
So
Yeah.
what does make up the People's Party of is it America? Is that the proper name for the party, first of all?
People's Party of the United States. That's what we
United
go by.
States.
Yeah.
Well, see, it's the People's Party of Canada on this side of the border. And I kind of wonder how similar it is. I know they're both populist parties, and I find it interesting because the People's Party of Canada was sort of formed from conservative roots, but I'm getting the sense from you that your party was formed from the socialist side. Is that fair?
We describe ourselves as populist because one of, as like we were talking about before, we really see these kind of the left-right dichotomy as not being a useful kind of, framework anymore, because it really is just everybody against these kind of like really rich, oligarchs and the corrupt politicians who they buy, who are trying to impose this kind of, technological dystopia on us, through mass surveillance and censorship and vaccine mandates and, everything else that it is. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, very much our roots were from the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's sort of the opposite side, if you want to look at it on a scale like that, which I generally don't. But if you look at it that way, conservative roots here, but socialist sort of roots over there. And then we've, in the Canadian side, even though it's viewed as sort of a conservative kind of a populist party, I don't think it is anymore in Canada either. It's a blending of all these different political ideologies that have come together under a populist banner. And there's a strong socialist side to the PPC now that even extends beyond that. But maybe you can comment further on that. Are you seeing more of a conservative element bleed into the demographics of your party?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the things that I'm most proud of is that, we have in fact managed to bring people of all ideologies, people who voted for Trump, in one of the past two presidential elections, people who've, who haven't voted at all. Because there's 100 million people in the United States, who just don't vote ever because they've given up on the two parties. So yeah. And then if like Gloria was mentioning too, Rage Against the War Machine, when we organized that in February, we brought together people from that coalition was, the Libertarian Party to, the People's Party to, just all across the political spectrum. And we were very proud. And, I in particular, very proud about how we brought together people across the spectrum for that action. Thousands of people rallied at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and then marched to the White House. So that's absolutely our objective.
That's interesting because I think through history, when you look at the populist movements in both countries, it's always times of turmoil that seem to result in a populist movement gaining momentum and growing. And it's like a catalyst issue or issues like the pandemic and civil liberties or the war in Ukraine and a call for peace that sort of unite people under a populist banner. But how do you keep it together? Because if you look back through history, the populist movement has had a difficult time remaining cohesive because once those core uniting issues are sort of dealt with or become less important to people, if it's like an economic issue where the economy eventually gets better, then it's those other issues that divide, say, conservatives and socialists that seem to tear the movement apart. Is there something within your party that would retain that glue that holds things together?
I would say that if we were to see all of the changes, there are so many things that bring people from, across the political spectrum, left and right, together at this point where we are, I think, in the United States. There's, the fact that it's like 80% of people live paycheck to paycheck. Half the country can afford like a $500 emergency. Everybody, is being so absolutely squeezed. People are just outraged at every new kind of giveaway that goes to Ukraine, while the infrastructure is crumbling here and the price of gas and groceries blow up. So, and then of course there's the political corruption, all the money that goes into politics here, the money from Wall Street and Silicon Valley and Big Pharma and everywhere, that goes into our politics here. And all of these, I think, are things that people can agree on. And so the more like across left and right, so the more kind of corrupt and down this path that we've gone, where the two parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, have just become more and more and more similar, and they've just kind of merged, at this point, where you can't even tell which is like the more anti-war party anymore. It seems to be the Democrats now, because they're advocating for more war money than the Republicans do. So that creates this just massive kind of vacuum where it's like this dynamic where you have a one-party state in the United States, the establishment party, and then there's just a giant vacuum with all these other issues, where there's huge agreement. So,
in some ways, it sounds like you're describing a class struggle, a modern class struggle. Is that about accurate?
It is. Have you heard this Richmond, North of Richmond song?
I have.
I think that very much embodies the spirit of what's happening in the United States now.
It has become something of an anthem, right, for the populist movement.
It has. Yeah. And the fact that it's been embraced by what's called the right here in the United States is, I think, amazing, because this is a song about class struggle. It's a song about low wages. It's a song about, kind of rich politicians that are, just running our lives. And all of those, have been thought, I think, by a lot of people as kind of these left-wing issues. And yet, we're seeing that really this is something that unites people across the spectrum.
Sorry, someone's trying to video chat me on Facebook while I'm talking to you, which is a little bit distracting. So would you say that how much dovetailing does your party have with, say, the Trump movement or even the RFK Jr. base of support? Because I see both of those candidates as populist, but you're actually running the, sort of the populist party, and yet those guys are with the establishment parties, and they're also very populist. That's where their base of support is. Is there much overlap there with those guys into what you're doing?
There's a significant amount. And one of the things that I think brings us all together is that we recognize that there's kind of this deep state. Kennedy calls it the corporate state in the United States, that is this unholy coming together of, the biggest corporations and oligarchs in the country, and then, corrupt government and intelligence agencies that are really running the country for their own kind of enrichment and at everybody else's expense. I think that's something that everybody is seeing and approaching from different perspectives. And Bernie kind of tried something similar too. He's a part of this populist wave. He was Bernie and Trump weren't even kind of like meaningfully members of their party when they ran in the primary in 2016. And so the outsider candidates who came from nowhere were the ones that dominated the primary. So there is this like populist revolution that has been is like basically struggling to be born here in the United States. And it's trying to work through the establishment parties right now. It's trying to work largely through the Republican Party, trying to work through the Democratic Party. And I think it's discovering the limits of working in those parties. especially in the Democratic Party, where Bernie was shut down with such a heavy hand. But in the Republican Party, it's been more successful, of course, with Trump, being able to take, kind of take hold there. But
And
the
why do you think
Democrat,
that is, Nick? If I could interrupt, why do you think
yeah.
that Trump and that populist movement was successful in taking back the GOP when movements to do that in the Democratic Party have failed?
I think it's because movements like Bernie. I think there's a couple reasons. One is kind of the fundamental interest of corporations that basically run the country, but another is strategic. In the first, it's that it's the most important to prevent any kind of like left change in this country. Like anything, whether it is higher wages or Medicare for all in this country, single payer, or anything like that. Or some kind of making sure there's affordable housing, stop abolishing homelessness, all things that we support at the People's Party. That is much more against the interests, I think, of the ruling class in this country than, say, Trump. The difference between a Trump and the ruling class is much smaller than the difference between a Bernie and the
Well,
ruling
Trump
class.
is the ruling class.
Trump is a ruling class. He's a billionaire.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of, isn't that a remarkable condemnation of our system? That Trump is really, in the big picture, so close to them ideologically. I mean, the guy came in and he slashed corporate taxes, did everything they wanted, put a bunch of billionaires in the administration, gutted a bunch of the agencies, the EPA and whatnot. And yet, they still can't tolerate him. They can't even tolerate that level of dissension, let alone a Bernie Sanders. And so that's why in the Democratic Party, you have things like super delegates and all these kind of like fail safes that are meant to like lock that party down so that nothing like happened with Trump and the Republican Party will ever happen in that party.
That's right. That's right. And I think, and I wanted to see if you guys agree with me, that rather than having a class war, which is what they fear the most, if the lower classes, the working classes all band together left and right, like what we're trying to do, and target the real enemy, which is sitting in the House of Government, they'd rather just start a civil war than have a class war. And I think that's what they're trying to do, is pit us against one another and start civil wars, not just here in the United States, but in Canada as well, which is something that Rick talks about a lot on Maverick News.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, Rick,
Who
I
wants
was,
to take that one?
I'm super interested in, how would you sum up what is most important to the People's Party in Canada and how it's come about?
Great question.
I think it has shifted, and I do not speak for the party. I don't want anyone to think that I'm sitting here speaking for Maxime Bernier or the party. This is entirely my own opinion on things. Okay. That party started because Maxime Bernier, who was a conservative, ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, lost by, I think, 1%. And he left, formed this new party, which, Canada's a different political animal. What's most important? It started off as a new conservative, a new home for homeless conservatives, because I felt too like the Conservative Party had left me. I didn't leave the party because they kept going further and further to the left and embracing more and more sort of, wokeism and that kind of ideology. Things have changed, though, I think, within the party over the last few years, especially since the onset of the pandemic. For me, it was about just embracing originally conservative economic principles, getting back to basics, getting away from wokeism. And it's evolved since then, because then the pandemic came and it was the PPC, the People's Party of Canada, that stood up for people. Really, it was the only party that stood up for people,
Right.
and people's individual rights and freedoms.
Because the conservatives really didn't
No,
in the beginning of the pandemic.
They never did. No, they
No.
did nothing to stand up to lockdowns, masking, mandatory vaccinations, which are all the issues that, that I think the true conservatives and people who are committed to the preservation of people's liberty, individual rights and freedoms are committed to. The Conservative Party did nothing. They let the people down and acted like liberals. So the PPC was there for that. But as the pandemic has carried on, I've seen the political landscape begin to shift here. And the PPC, I think, has embraced not just it's sort of a populist thing. And I'll get you to comment on this and see if the same thing is happening on your side. More of the, I'm just going to come out and say it. It's like the Q base. It's the common law sovereign citizens sort of movement. It's that ideology that has continued to grow and spread, and they've pulled people in who don't even really, I think, largely understand that that's what they're being pulled into here in Canada. And that same movement from the US, whether you're talking about the Oath Keepers or the constitutional sheriffs or any of these movements, they've begun to have more and more influence into the Canadian political sphere. That ideology has taken root. It's appealing more to not just the PPC, but separatist parties, smaller separatist parties in the western part of the country, and even separatist movements in Quebec. And they're getting involved with that. And even some First Nations. This ideology has found its way into there, which is very appealing here, because if you're talking about the sovereign citizens movement and you're talking about first law or Aboriginal common law, that thread weaves its way very easily through all of that and the history. So the PPC has seen this, I think, as an opportunity to build a base of support and latch on to some of these groups that have been there and have formed a web of organization. And so the PPC has been able to use that. And I think it's been there for actually quite some time, unseen, but it's becoming more present now. And so they're using that as an organizational foundation.
And more powerful, wouldn't you say, Rick? They have more power in the party than they used to.
Much more power now. And so you're seeing now this, I think, more pronounced emphasis on issues like LGBTQ issues, right? And the drag queen story times being taken into schools, and the PPC sort of embracing that as an issue that is very concerning to them. And if you want to talk about hashtag save the children, that kind of stuff, which is at the very center of the Q movement, it's becoming very prominent even within the PPC. And so because there's, that to me too is why the Trump campaign today feels so much different today than it did in 2015, 2016.
It sure does.
Because that stuff was not prominent even in the US. It was there, but not prominent. And then by 2017, it became a political force to be reckoned with. It now, I think, almost dominates the MAGA movement. It has become so prominent, and we're seeing that same sort of, well, just within the last year, especially year and a half, 2 years, it has found its way into Canada. And for a bunch of reasons, I have theories on why that's happening, but maybe
it's
you
a
want to comment on
curious
that.
thing. It's like a coalescing of the Q movement and the freedom movement, the anti-mandate, anti-vaccine movement, and the sovereign citizen movement all coming together. And up there in Canada, we see that happening a lot inside the People's Party, inside what used to be called the Truckers' Freedom Movement. And it's this weird evolution. And do you see that happening in the United States too, Nick?
Yeah, I would say so. That it is kind of a convergence of movements that are,
Yep.
I think one of the threads that ties them together is that they don't kind of accept the kind of consensus reality, like the mainstream media,
True.
sanitized reality. And they're much more ready and willing to embrace what in the United States is dismissed as conspiracy theory. Whether it is, the conspiracy theories around the origin of COVID, or whether it is, around the war in Ukraine, or whatever it is, because this kind of, I think this term, which I know originated with the CIA, conspiracy theory, it's become such a catch-all that, it really, I mean, it seems like its definition is now anything that the establishment doesn't want you to know or think about, or any perspective that the establishment doesn't like. And so I think there's all of these different kind of, because here in the US, the mainstream media, Washington Post, New York Times, they wrote off, the truckers, they wrote off, anybody who questioned, the vaccine safety. Conspiracy theorists, anybody who questioned, our motives for being in Ukraine, the United States, conspiracy theorists, conspiracy theory. Oh, so it's like, okay, well, this is now, there's kind of, I think, a renaissance happening in the United States where people are like, that term has almost like flipped. People are embracing that. And it's like, yeah, that, I've seen these memes, for example, very popular memes. Being conspiracy theorist just means you're 2 years ahead, or something like that. So I do see though that similar kind of, I see a coalescence, and I think Rage Against the War Machine reflects part of it. Actually, it's kind of it's like a it's a part of that. It's a part of, there's a much greater willingness to come together. There's a breakdown of the silos that used to kind of like separate us. We used to each have kind of our own medias, and we were kind of like artificially segmented into our own reality, and we were just taught to demonize the other person, on the other side, whether it's the left or the right. There was MSNBC, Fox, and all of that's breaking down now to the point where it's like people are loss of confidence in the media. That's another big thing. People are just dismissing the whole kind of apparatus, the whole corporate media apparatus, and the propaganda machine that is the government, and they are talking to each other and working with each other. And so those kinds of like caricatures or stereotypes that used to exist about each other, like, for example, between people on the left and libertarians, like, okay, those are falling away because now we're working together. Now we've met each other. Now we understand that there's a kind of a common humanity that underlies the work that we do. And so as that breaks down, I think it's very challenging to the establishment. It threatens their grip.
Politics makes strange bedfellows, indeed, right? That's what this show is all about. That's what the coalition that you're involved with, Rage Against War, is all about. And the people's parties of both of our countries, in the US and Canada, is, it's not ideologically pure on the left or the right. Rick tells me that there are socialists inside the People's Party of Canada. It started as a conservative kind of party, but over time, it's attracting some more progressives and socialists. And I would think the People's Party in the United States, you might be seeing some more libertarian and right-wing people coming into your movement. Are you?
Absolutely. It's kind of like we began on different sides, Rick, and our parties, so to speak, and we're kind of converging.
Because it's that those unifying issues, like in times of crisis, civil liberties issues, or it could be economic issues, but it's a crisis that kind of brings people together, most often under a populist banner like yours.
That's right.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.